Okay, we're going to take a look today at setting up our database environment so that we can understand, test a little bit against SQL injections, and because we no longer have access to PHPMyAdmin as a database front-end tool, nor should we because of the vulnerabilities it introduces, we're going to take a look at some other tools. One of the tools that I like to use, and you don't have to use, you can use any tool you want, is a database front-end tool available from SQLmanager.net. And I like this for a number of reasons. First off, it's a great front-end tool to manage our databases. More importantly, there is a free version as well. If you go to the home page of SQLmanager.net and scroll down to the very bottom, you will see an area called Free Database Tools. If you click on that, it will take you to the Free Database Administration and Development Tools page. And very first on this list is the EMS SQL Manager for MySQL. It will also work for Mariah. There's other front ends for Microsoft SQL Server. That's not a bad tool, but SQL has pretty good front end tools. There's a nice front end for Postgres. I've used that. It works really, really well as well. And there's other tools as well. We are going to download the EMS SQL Manager for MySQL freeware version. So please click and download that tool at this time. It's 100 and some meg. It's 75 meg. It's not 100 meg, it's 75 meg. It used to be like 108 meg in the past, I thought, but I could be remembering incorrectly. Regardless, once you download this and set it up, which is what we're going to be doing today, you're going to find that for the first month or so that you use it, it's always going to say, hey, try the full version, try the full version. The problem is once you try the full version, you can't go back to the free version easily. I've never been able to do it. I haven't really tried, but I've always stayed with using the free version. Try and avoid as much as possible clicking on trying the full version, because it might sabotage you because it'll stop working after 30 days or something like that. So unless you want to actually buy a copy, which I don't necessarily have a problem with, try and keep saying ignore, 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 or no, or just close or whatever the dialog box is. We'll see it in a sec. Is everybody downloading the SQL Manager software? Are there any questions? All right. Once it's downloaded, you can walk through and do the installer. It's a standard installer. There isn't anything complicated or weird about it. Once you have it installed, it will give you an interface that looks like this, the SQL Manager for MySQL. All right. You're going to need to configure this to allow connections to your databases. Oh, maybe I should install the more recent one. You know what I'm going to install? We talked about an update, so let's do the install together. Oh yes, Microsoft's favorite. Hey, you didn't get this from us. Are you sure you want to do it? It's up to you, but you're gonna. I would say install anyway. English next. I accept next. The default location should be fine. Those are entirely up to you. Who uses a desktop anymore?
People who don't have good wallpapers. Those are people who use.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. And then it'll start it. And you're probably going to see a different startup than what I see. Every time it starts for the first month, it's going to say, hey, do you want to try the full version? I don't know if you're going to see that or not, but it's quite possible you're going to see that. Just keep saying, no, I don't want the full version. Just let me use this version. It also has a tips that pop up as well. I believe this has a tips screen as well. When it starts up, you can have that remove or not show at beginning as well. That's entirely up to you. At the end of the day, the way that this is handled is that I think you're allowed to have up to 3 databases running at any one time. So you're going to see me add and removing databases. What's going on? Why is my system spooling? Just, I need to do this. I apologize. I only have 4 hours of VM time, so I need to get this working. I apologize for doing that during your lecture. I really am sorry. Okay, so you can only really have 3 databases. And when I say databases, I'm not talking about IP addresses. I'm actually talking about individual databases on a specific server somewhere. You're only allowed 3 or maybe 5. I can't remember which it is, but I'm pretty sure it's only 3. Consequently, you're going to see me adding and removing databases, and that's why. It doesn't take anything away from the product. If you're going to use more, then maybe you should actually buy a licensed copy of it. I don't know. I've always been able to do, with all the work that I do, I've been able to just use the freeware version, and it meets my needs. It's a lovely little tool. Consider it in your careers going forward. Okay? For this to work, however, you have to allow remote connections to your database. So when you first start up, you get a list of databases that is basically empty here. Okay? If we want to connect to our Debian environment, it's not enough that it is running. By default, when we installed the Mariah database, it limited connections to localhost only. So we're going to have to go in to our Mariah configuration and say allow other connections from other places. Okay, so let's take a look at that right now. If you have downloaded the Mariah login script with encryption tutorial, there's 2 documents we're going to reference today. There's 2 things we're going to take a look at. We're going to create, actually you're going to create a login script on your own. I'm going to walk through a lot of this stuff in the presentation, but I'm going to get you to create your own login scripts if you want, and then add them to the StungEye blog software, and that's what you can work on the rest of the week. Okay? Before we can get this to work, we have to make some changes to our environment. Okay? So let's take a look at that. You can open up your terminal, but as always, I'm going to be section 1 or section 2. It must be section 1. Yep, section 1. Okay, my apologies. Section 1. Okay, I need to get this working because it's just too difficult to do otherwise, so just give me 1 sec here. Section 1, load. It's section 1. I must have clicked on the wrong one again. We are actually changing server configurations, so we're going to need to be logged in as root. Alrighty? Is everybody logged into their Debian as root? Any questions? Anybody not able to log in? Okay. If you can't log in as root, I really can't help you. If you can log in as root but not a regular user, that I can help with because there's ways of resetting passwords as root for regular users. But if you've lost your root password, I really can't help you with that. Okay? If we take a look at the document, there's a directory in the etc directory called MySQL, and then there is a Mariah configuration directory, and then there's a server.cnf file. We're going to take a look at that file right now, all right, with the nano command. And then we want to look at, and tab really is your friend. in this environment. Client? No, server. Okay. Tab really is your friend when you're trying to modify some of these files. First off, you must become root. And the nano is the text editor that we use, and /etc my tab, mar tab, o tab, auto completes. 50 tab, s tab, and it auto completes a lot of the content for me, and it ensures that my typing is correct. Now my resolution is going to be a little different than yours. You may see more screens, informations of screen than what I have in place. Okay? So what you want to do is you want to change this from 127.0.0.1. You just want to allow different networks. Now I don't want to get into setting up a host-only network and all of that stuff. We're not going to get that nuanced with it, but in a production environment you would limit connections to whatever network that you want to allow. In most cases, if you're using MySQL, chances are you're doing a simple LAMP stack and it's going to be a local host connection. You don't even need to make this change. If you are, however, allowing remote connections to your database, this is where you no longer have a simple AMP stack and it's rolled out into a different environment. You want to allow different people to connect to it, and that's kind of what we're showing here. By saying 0.0.0.0, you're allowing any connection anywhere on your network. Okay? Control O to save it, Control X. And once you've done that, you want to restart the Mariah service. Or in this case, the MySQL service as well. Alright? So it is system CTL restart and then mysql.service. Like that, and it'll restart the MySQL service. You can also do something like service Mariah DB and then restart. There's different ways of restarting these services. You can use system control, system CTL, or you can just use the service command and restart it as well. I've given the instructions in the handout. They use system CTL. I don't care. You can always do a reboot as well and make sure that the settings take. Okay? You really do need to ensure that that line is set properly in your environment. All right? You don't want to change the port. The port is the same. It shouldn't need any changing. It should be good to go. Okay? Any questions? Does that make sense? Okay. We've downloaded and installed the database management tool. We have configured our database server software to allow non-local host connections. The test is now to try and connect to our database, and we do that right-clicking inside the databases window and register. We're not creating a database, we are registering a database to be used with this application. Okay? We can also go databases and register database. Okay? We're not going to register a database, we're merely testing our connectivity at this point. So we're going to right-click, register a database, and it's going to say what's the local host. And of course, it's not a local host connection, it's a network connection. So we need to specify the IP address. You need to know yours. Mine is 192.168.56.191. Okay? The username is not going to be root. The username that we can use is DVWA, and the password is DVWA. We know that we created these properly last time. Okay? If you did, we all did the DVWA activity together, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so we all have a DVWA database created that we can attempt a connection to. Okay? So we have a username DVWA, we have a password DVWA, we specified an IP address of a database server. We have not specified a database yet. No, that didn't work. Okay, that's because I need to create the database, so that's not going to work. Let's try this. I always hate doing this. I don't think that's going to work. It's not going to allow us a root connection, so that's fine. We're going to go in and we're going to do something else. The next thing I want you to do is on the bottom of page 3 of the handout. Like we did with the database, we are going to create a database and give access to that database to everybody. But as you can see with the code at the bottom of page 3 of that Word handout, it's going to be a little different this time. I don't use localhost connections, and that's why my DVWA didn't work, and as I was typing it I realized it wasn't going to work because I gave access to localhost. So you see two different users, a blog user, which is a localhost connection, and a blog admin, which is a more global connection. The percent, if you recall, the percent is more of a wild card in the SQL world. And that's what we're seeing at the bottom of page 3 of the Mariah login script example. So let's take a look at that. MySQL-u root. It lets us in, and we're going to create database blog, semicolon. Okay, show databases. We should see a couple that we've created now, blog and DVWA. As we did before, we need to grant permissions. We're going to grant all privileges on blog.star to blog user at localhost identified by some password string. Alright? Obviously you would never use the word password, but this gives us a password that we can use for our connection strings for the blog software that we're going to build going forward. You should probably choose a better password than password, but again, you do you. Okay? At the end of these things, you always want to have a semicolon. Okay? Grant all privileges on blog.star to blog user at localhost identified by password. I've created the database. Now I'm creating a user to access that. Don't seem to have had any typos. That's awesome. Grant all privileges on blog.star to blog admin at everywhere identified by an even better password. Okay? As always, flush these privileges when you set up new users and or modify the privileges or the permissions that your users have. Okay? Now we can better test. We cannot connect to any user that only has localhost connectivity, which is the problem we had with the DVWA test that I tried earlier. However, we have given remote connection to blog admin. And more importantly, I can't show you, I'm sorry. I've also modified the server config to allow remote connections, and I restarted the server and I flushed the privileges. I should be able to better test my connection now. Alright, so the username is no longer root, it is blog admin, and the password is password. Click on next. And if you can do the drop down list and get a database name, you have successfully configured your database for remote access, and you have successfully configured the user blog admin to take advantage of that remote access. Okay, again, how did I do this? After I created the database, created the two users, one of which has remote access, and after I reconfigured my server configuration to allow non-local host connections, I go into my database management software, in this case the SQL Manager, register a database, not create, but register a database. It is not localhost, it is IP based. My IP address was 192.168.56.191. The username was blog admin, the password was password. We're not using named pipes, we're connecting directly. We click on next. And this is the test. If we can find something in the drop-down list, then we have successfully done all of the pieces. We can click on finish and we will see the database in our list of databases. We are not connected. We merely have a connection to it. We are not connected until we double click on it. When we double click on it and it gets bold and it shows all the different object types of the database, we are now connected to our database. Are there any questions? Is what I've done here make sense? Is everybody at this point? Wow, there's a lot of people on this call. Wow. Is everybody at this point? Is anybody not at this point? Is anybody struggling at this point? Please be honest. So everybody has a connection to their database. I'm going to assume that's a yes. All right. Let's now take a look at the PowerPoint presentation that I have in Learn, the one that I made visible to you guys by mistake, but it doesn't really matter. Okay? We can go through and do the same thing as we did before. We can create a database called MyDB, and we can create admin access to that. We can create a table called users, and we could add a couple of records to our users. And you know what? Let's do a little bit of memory muscle on this one. Let's do that exact same thing again. So if you take a look at slide 3 of the handout, we're going to do that yet again. We are connected to the database as root, so we can create access to our database and everything. So what I want you to do is to create a new database. All right. There's the MyDB database. We've created blog, DVWA, and MyDB. Can't connect to it, but that's fine. We're going to create a connection to it now. So, as we did before, up arrow is your friend, ladies and gentlemen. Up arrow is your friend. I'm going to grant all privileges on mydb.star to mydb admin. Yeah, that looks good. Identified by password. Do not copy and paste the code out of that PowerPoint presentation. There is a smart quote. It will break your code. All right, so don't copy and paste the code. It will not work. You don't have to type this in like you've had to type in everything else. Okay? Or you could be lazy like me and use the up arrow and change a couple of strings. Okay? As always, we're going to flush the privileges. And to be honest, we could do the remainder of these activities inside this tool. We could just keep hacking away at all of these database activities, but you know what? We've set up a database management tool. Let's use it. I am going to register another database. Same IP address as before. It's going to be a different username, MyDB admin, or whatever you used. Same password as before, click on Next. Our drop-down list of available databases should be specific to that user ID. The only person who has remote access, the only database that that user has remote access to is the MyDB database. We're going to select that and click on Finish. And now you should see another database listed. This one's connected. It shows it as connected because it's bold, and I guess there's a gold icon. The MyDB, we have a connection to it, but we are not connected. Double click on it, and now I've got two databases and I'm connected to both. Please ensure for this part of the lecture you are in the MyDB database. Is everybody at that point? Are there any questions? Does that make sense? Alrighty. I am guessing you've done some more of this than other students have in the past, because usually I have a couple of questions at this point. So either you're real tired from something else or you've seen a lot of this already in the past. I'm going to assume it is the latter and just hope for the best. Screw you, you piece of... Damn it! Thanks, Kiki. Sorry, Sorry, I don't mean to swear in front of you guys. It is certainly not your fault, but I'm really struggling with Azure services, and I'm about ready to pass on this entire project. So I apologize for keep jumping back and forth into that. Okay, everybody minimize the structure of objects in your blog. We're going to come back to that later, and I want you to expand and focus on the MyDB database. Okay, when you select this, you have access to a number of tools, not the least of which is SQL editors that you can see in the top arrow here. You can hit F12 and that will open up an editor for you. Please note, you can switch between databases. I don't know how clearly you can see that, but your title bar will say what database you're working on, the database will say what database you're working on, and the status bar at the bottom will say what database the SQL editor is working on at that point. It is very important that you work on the right database, and if you are worried, an easy thing is to only connect to one database at a time. If I was being extra cautious, and we should always be cautious with our databases, I would disconnect from the database I'm not working on, so there's no chance that I'm going to accidentally do anything to that database. You do you. You're at the final stage of your education. I'll leave it up to you to decide how you want to manage your database, but I would say disconnect from the database so that you only have one connection, so you can't accidentally do this to the wrong database. Okay? Any questions? Alright, so now we're going to start taking a look at the code that you can find in this PowerPoint presentation. And because I am not a fan of making students type things unnecessarily, all of the code can be found in today's lectures module. If you take a look at the setup.sql file, all of the code is right here. Okay? So if you want, and believe me, I am happy with you copying and pasting the code that I've given you in setup.sql. You can highlight that, copy it, and then paste it into your editor. Okay? The SQL editor in SQL Manager Lite for MySQL, you can copy and paste that code. Once you've pasted it, you can hit the F9 key or click on the little green Go Gadget button. When you click on that, it says it's okay. The problem is you get no indication that anything's happened here unless you right-click and refresh objects. Refresh database, sorry. Select refresh database and it'll refresh and it'll show you your new table members. And you can click on that. You can double click on it, it'll open it up, It'll show you any data that might be in there. It'll show you fields. And this is very handy when it comes to setting up your database and showing me the competencies for creating your version of the Stung-Eye blog software. So being able to show me the data is going to be handy. All right? But let's stay here. I'm happy with that. I can comment it out. Quick code, there it is. Toggle comment, so I can comment out an entire block of code and I don't have to worry about it. Or, frankly, I can just simply delete it. All right? Once you have the code created, we're going to need to populate our table. All right? I've given you a simple one-line insert statement. Insert into members a single record. Go gadget execute. I believe that did something. Yep, I have a record Johnny, not Johnny, but John, and a password of 1234. Even worse than the passwords that I've used in other parts of this class. So, back to my editor. It executed so fast I didn't even realize that it executed, but I can verify that the record is there by double-clicking on the table, which will take you to a new tab across the bottom, and there's the Fields tab inside the object information, and then there is a Data tab, and it is in the Data tab, by resizing the columns, you can verify that the username John and the password 1234 has been created. Is everybody at this point? Are there any questions? No questions? Awesome. Let's now take a look at examples of SQL injections. If you were to take no, that's not what I want. Let's take a look at the Learn shell again and see. The database, you know what? Download the database security file for me, please, for this class. It's the notes file we want. Yeah, that's the one. So let's step back and do this again. Okay? Not only did I have a setup file for you in today's class, and we've made use of that, but I also had a zip file that had a bunch of stuff in it as well, including some of the files you will need for the self-directed activity coming up. When we take a look at the contents of this zip file, one of them is called notes.txt. Please take a look at that at this time. Okay, where you've got a bunch of create information, and you've got some population. If you want, you can put a couple more records in there. You know what, I'm going to do that anyway. Where's my database management tool? Right here. I'm going to go back to my editor. I believe it'll auto-generate. Let's see if that works. It's members. So there is some issues with the code, sorry, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. I'm going to get rid of all of that. This is the important thing I want you to keep in mind. Okay? I was using members up here. That's probably for the blog software. I opened up the wrong one and I should have been using the users table, but it's okay. I want you to understand your environment, so focus on that. This is the important part here. If you were to take a look online and see examples of bad code, as we talked about in the past, the classic example I like to use is the Stack Overflow, how do I create a login script? Well, just use something like this. And frankly, you see this far too often. You allow people to log in where the username is equal to a username and the password is equal to a password supplied. Both of these supplied by form data. This is problematic. I never want to see your code that does this. Okay? What I've done in the example is what I want you to use rather than that. So that's what we're going to take a look at. We've got a database called members. Let's take a look at that. Select. Let's modify this code so you can see it a little bit better. So I've got the members table. Select count from members. Where username and password. And if you recall up here, we set the password to 1234. Okay? Select count from members where username is John and password is 1234. That's the command I want you to type. Because this is what you often see. Alright? In inherently designed weak systems. So I'm going to run that command and see what I get. We haven't screwed it up. You don't really see other than it succeeded, but when you take a look at the form view, it will actually, there it is. The grid view. The form view shows the results, but the grid view of the result is what we are interested in. Here's our command, here's our results, and we want the grid view, and it shows that the count is equal to 1. What you see in compromised code is, okay, if count is equal to 1, or more commonly, because coders like to think they're cool, they'll say if the variable stores count. If count means that it's true and not 0. If count, the user's logged in, let them log in. And that's problematic, and that's what we want to avoid as much as possible. Okay? So, why? Well, let's go back to our code, and what we are going to do is we are going to inject a little bit of code. The username, we're going to leave at John. Doesn't really matter though. The password we're going to set is tick or 1 is equal to 1, and either -- or hash, depending on what we think the database management software is. Okay? The password injection string is very important. We know it's MySQL, so we're not going to bother with the --. That's the ANSI SQL standard comment. It might work in MySQL, but in MySQL the hash usually works better. So we assume we'll try that first because we assume MySQL is more popular. And if there's going to be a vulnerability, it's going to be someone who doesn't have something like Oracle or Postgres deployed. So we're going to try this injection. We're going to copy that and make that my password, and look what happens to the code. The password string gets closed off. Options. That's just hideous. Well, that was a joke. Career new. I wanted something bold, but that's okay. That should be a little easier for you to read. Okay? Select count. By adding this string as the SQL injection, this is what it does to our SQL statement. It closes off the form data supplied for the password it makes the statement always true. Or 1 is equal to 1 is always going to test true. And then it adds a comment to comment out the rest of the code. This is SQL Injection 101. This block of text right here, either one of these, is SQL Injection 101. This is creating a standard SQL injection. Because now, when we run this, I don't know, I had it highlighted. That's what it was. If you had code, if you go back and you highlight code, it only executes what you have highlighted. So don't have anything highlighted in this editor and then click on execute. Because anything you have highlighted is what gets executed when you hit the go query button. Okay? This looks very similar to the results that we got when we actually supplied the correct username and password. Any questions on that? Does that make sense? Okay. Let's move on. I'm sorry, I actually have a headache right now, guys, so I'm having a hard time focusing on this. We might have to wrap this up a little bit sooner because my headache is not going away. Let's take a look at... We could. I could take a break, but that's not going to make things better. Let's talk about... I appreciate that, thanks. Can't think.
I'm sorry to distract you. It's okay.
No, I appreciate it. You're actually trying to help, Kiki, and I actually do appreciate that. It's all good. Yeah, I know. Okay. Let's take a look at this injection right here. Let's say that that becomes our injection. This is not the scenario we have here. Let's say that the username becomes this, and then the password is left null. If you have a system that you think the username table is called username, what do you think is going to happen with something like that?
I didn't quite hear the question. Can you repeat it?
Okay, if you substitute where I said the username was John and the password was an SQL injection, what if I do something like this to the username?
Okay.
Speak louder, Bruno, please. I can't hear you.
Receive all of the user accounts that started with an A.
Exactly. And what typically is the admin account in a lot of these open source projects? What did it used to be called? Admin, exactly. And it is also typically the first account created when you deploy applications. So what if I do this? Who do you think I'm going to log in as?
Admin.
Yes. Which is why you see a lot of... We're going to wrap this up because... I'm sorry, we're going to wrap this up. We're going to pick this up next week because I want you guys to get this set up. We used to see products, and I mentioned this before, I hope. We used to see products like WordPress and Joomla and things like Drupal and other CMS systems deployed with an administrator account called admin that was created as the first record or possibly the second record in the users table. And it was a huge vulnerability, and it was so bad in WordPress that we would see entire libraries dedicated to hacking WordPress. When we take a look at Kali Linux and we take a look at the Metasploit framework for attacking websites, you're going to see an entire tool called or an entire set of tools dedicated to attacking WordPress sites. They were so vulnerable for so long and so problematic that entire tool sets were built to attack WordPress. They've gotten better, but it has been a known and ongoing problem for a long time. The thing is that WordPress group would release all of these hardening documents. Oh, you need to do this, you need to do this. But they also made it super easy to deploy very vulnerable sites, and that's what people did. So that's what an SQL injection is. I'm going to move on. I'm going to go through the PowerPoint slides. We're going to keep talking about these things, and I'm going to let you guys play with these on your own. Okay? If you want, and I've given you all of these things, you can deploy the necessary forms into your Debian environment and make a connection. Okay? This is purposefully a bad connection. I specifically used MySQLi as a connection tool. I purposefully did not use PDO because it's a lot harder to do this in PDO. It's not impossible, but it's a lot harder to do. I specifically used the MySQLi library so that I could more easily create problems. Once you have that, you can start playing with some of these injections that we have here. Okay? That's what I'm going to task you guys with. Some of the injections are pretty bad. These are known injections that worked in the past with Microsoft SQL Server. You used to be able to do command shells, such as restart your IIS server, format your hard drive, or drop your database. These were all valid SQL injections in the past, and Microsoft Access had similar functionality and had similar vulnerabilities. We rarely see these anymore, and so much so that most libraries prevent you from doing command chaining when it comes to SQL injections. You have to enable it specifically in your scripts, just like command chainings for command line injections have to be enabled. Command chaining for SQL has to be enabled in your scripts. It is disabled by default in most of the drivers that we see for database connectivity. Any questions on that? Okay, having gone through all of that, this joke should make more sense. And again, if you're not reading XKCD, if you're not reading XKCD, you really should. XFCE is a Windows manager, not a comic. XKCD, if you ever go to a conference and somebody's walking around with, "Hello, my name is Little Bobby Tables," you know that they're either a database person or somebody who wants to be a hacker. Okay? How do we mitigate against this? If we take a look at the sample code that I gave you, I created 3 different users: a login user, a register user, and then a normal user. Depending on the specific task that you want your different users to do, you can have up to 3 separate users. Someone who registers, and then you limit their permissions to only the table and the columns that they need to register. You give them access to nothing else. Was it perfect? No. But security is a layered approach. You just keep adding layers to your security to mitigate against risks. You create another user for the logon process. They have no rights. They merely have reads to the necessary table, and they only read a couple of columns. The register can write, and they're going to need to do some reads as well to make sure that the records aren't already there. But again, you limit the scope of what they can do. Once they're logged in, and you can track their activities with other parts of your application, that's when you use a third ID, which gives them full access. And you can do this at the database level, at the table level, and even at the column level. And you can also manage it with views. Although be careful with views. Views generally don't let you modify data, but they will allow you to read data. So you can do a lot of this with views as well. All of your DBMS 1 and 2 stuff should come back. You can filter out threats. By itself, it's not enough, but you can add filtering to the process. You can limit input sizes. Never trust anything from the browser. We saw this before. It's very easy to manipulate the DOM, so never trust anything that comes from the browser. If you're going to limit something, have server-side scripting components that limit the size. All right? Is it enough by itself? Of course not. There's always going to be some field somewhere in your form that's going to allow a large amount of data. But at the end of the day, limiting it will help. Set as much as possible your form data to post. You can still use gets for addresses and stuff like that, but limit your data as much as possible to posts. It's a little harder to automate the attacks. We will see, however, very shortly some tools that will automate a post attack for us. So again, it's not enough by itself. But all of these things together make it more difficult to attack your site, and that's what we're going after. Data validation. If it's only numbers that you expect from form elements, then limit those to those specific data types, again on the server side. Any questions? One of the best ways you can mitigate against attacks is using a mature database abstraction library. There are libraries out there that are always on top of this all the time, and they mitigate against a lot of these attacks. Cake, Struts, ASP.NET, all of these frameworks come with their own database abstraction libraries as well that are very mature in their nature. Another great one is PDO, is one of the more popular database abstractions for PHP. It comes by default now. Use it, but use it, right? And then finally, one of the less commonly talked about injections or injection mitigations is line breaks. If we go back, and this is one I want you to consider. If I take a look at my code, and this is my injection right here, simply putting a break in the statement negates this injection right here. Why? Because the comment in SQL is only going to work until the end of the line. Okay? If I have a break in my SQL code, and obviously this is an oversimplistic version, you make it more complicated, you have more lines. By having more lines, and more importantly, lines after form data is being processed, you prevent injections from occurring. Okay? Because the comment, whether it is the hash or the double dash, only works to the end of the line, to that line. And I'm sure you've seen, you can have multi-line SQL statements embedded in your PHP or JavaScript code very easily. So that's these are my two favorites actually. Line breaks and database abstractions are two of the better ways of mitigating against SQL injections. Any questions? Okay. I was going to ask you to set up the blog software, but you know what? We'll do that later. We'll do that next class. What I'm going to ask you to do instead is to deploy in the zip file that I gave you the login, the clean login, the injection, and the sanitized injection forms. Have them connect to your database, and on your own, test these injections that you see on slides 10 through 13. All right? And see if you can get these working. If you don't mind, also make sure that you've populated your database properly. Some copying and pasting might not work, but at this point I have every confidence that you can figure this out on your own. All right? I'm going to stop the recording now.